The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Jefferson High School as Robert Martinez stepped out of his old pickup truck. His hands trembled slightly as he straightened his jacket, the same navy blue blazer he had worn to every important family event for the past 20 years. At 78 years old, his body carried the weight of decades, but his eyes still held that sharp awareness that never quite left men who had served in combat. Robert had driven 3 hours from his small apartment in the countryside to reach the city. His grandson, Tommy, was graduating today, and nothing in the world could have kept him away. Tommy was the first person in their family to finish high school with honors, and Robert's chest swelled with pride every time he thought about it. The boy's mother, Robert's daughter Maria, had raised him alone after her husband left when Tommy was just 5 years old. She worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table and clothes on his back. The old veteran walked slowly toward the school gymnasium, his right leg dragging just a little, an old injury from his service days that never quite healed properly. Other families rushed past him, dressed in their finest clothes, carrying flowers and balloons. Robert carried only himself and his pride. He had wanted to bring flowers, but his monthly pension check did not stretch as far as it used to, and he had already spent what he could spare on gas money for the trip. Inside the gymnasium, hundreds of white folding chairs faced a stage decorated with the school colors of blue and gold. Parents and grandparents filled the seats quickly, saving spots for other family members. Robert found a seat near the back, far from the stage. He did not mind. He could still see well enough, and being in the back meant he would not block anyone's view. A young mother with 2 small children sat down next to him, struggling to keep the kids quiet. Robert smiled at the children and offered them each a piece of peppermint candy from his pocket. The mother thanked him gratefully. He had always carried candy, ever since his own children were small. It was a habit he never broke, even though his kids were grown now and had kids of their own. The little girl next to him, no more than 4 years old, stared at the faded tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve. The ceremony began with the principal welcoming everyone. Robert sat up straighter in his chair, his eyes scanning the rows of graduates in their caps and gowns. He spotted Tommy in the 3rd row, sitting tall and proud. The boy looked so much like his father at that age before life had hardened him. Robert pushed that thought away. Today was about celebrating Tommy's achievement, not dwelling on the past. As the principal droned on about the future and opportunities, Robert's mind drifted back to his own youth. He had not graduated from high school. When he was 17, he had lied about his age and joined the Navy. It was 1964, and the country was heading deeper into a conflict that would change him forever. He did not regret his service, but he often wondered what his life might have been like if he had stayed in school, if he had made different choices. The sound of applause brought him back to the present. The valedictorian was giving a speech about dreams and perseverance. Robert listened with half his attention, the other half focused on Tommy. The boy was fidgeting with his cap, probably nervous about walking across that stage. Robert remembered that feeling, that mixture of excitement and fear before a big moment. Around him, parents were taking photos and videos with their phones. Robert had a phone, an old flip phone that Maria had insisted he carry for emergencies, but he had never learned how to take pictures with it. He would have to rely on his memory of this day, storing it away with all the other important moments he had witnessed over his long life. The temperature in the gymnasium was rising as more people packed in. Robert unbuttoned his jacket, revealing more of his crisp white shirt underneath. He had ironed it himself this morning, taking care to get the collar just right. Maria had offered to pick him up, to save him the long drive, but he had refused. He did not want to be a burden, and besides, he enjoyed the independence of making the journey himself. As the ceremony continued, various teachers gave speeches and awards were handed out. Tommy received recognition for his excellence in mathematics, and Robert clapped louder than anyone around him. The young mother next to him smiled at his enthusiasm. Her children had fallen asleep in their chairs, worn out by the wait. Finally, the moment arrived when graduates would walk across the stage to receive their diplomas. The principal began calling names in alphabetical order. Robert sat forward in his seat, his heart beating faster. The M names were coming up soon. He thought about all the times he had helped Tommy with homework during his visits, the way the boy's face would light up when he finally understood a difficult concept. When Tommy's name was called, Robert stood up, not caring that he was blocking the view of people behind him. He watched his grandson walk confidently across that stage, shake hands with the principal, and accept his diploma. In that moment, Robert felt a surge of emotion so powerful that tears stung his eyes. This was what it was all about. This was why his generation had sacrificed so much. So that boys like Tommy could have opportunities, could build better lives. As Tommy returned to his seat, clutching his diploma, he scanned the crowd. When his eyes found Robert standing in the back, his face broke into a huge grin. He raised his diploma high in the air, and Robert raised his hand in acknowledgement. It was their moment, grandfather and grandson, connected across the crowded room by pride and love. Robert sat back down, wiping his eyes quickly. The ceremony continued, but for him the important part was over. He had seen what he came to see. His grandson had made it. Despite all the challenges, despite growing up without a father, despite the struggles Maria faced, Tommy had succeeded. Robert allowed himself to feel proud, not just of Tommy, but of Maria too, for raising such a fine young man. The gymnasium was warm and stuffy, and Robert felt suddenly tired. The long drive, the excitement, the emotion of the day was catching up with him. He decided he would wait until the ceremony ended, then find Tommy and Maria in the crowd outside. He would congratulate them properly, maybe take them out for ice cream if his budget allowed it. It would be a good day, a day to remember. The ceremony was winding down when the gymnasium doors at the back suddenly opened. 3 men in formal military dress uniforms entered, and the atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Robert noticed them right away, his old instincts still sharp. The man in the center wore the uniform of a Navy SEAL commander, his chest decorated with ribbons and medals that told stories of service and sacrifice. The 2 men flanking him were also SEALs, their bearing unmistakably military. People began whispering and turning in their seats. It was unusual for military personnel to attend a high school graduation in such formal capacity. Robert watched with curiosity as the 3 men stood at attention near the back entrance, scanning the crowd. The SEAL commander said something to one of his companions, who nodded and began moving along the back wall. Robert returned his attention to the stage, where the final student was receiving their diploma. The principal returned to the microphone and announced that everyone should remain seated for one more special presentation. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. This was not part of the printed program that had been handed out at the entrance. The SEAL commander began walking down the center aisle, his shoes clicking precisely against the floor. Every eye in the gymnasium followed him. Robert felt a strange sensation in his chest, something between curiosity and an old familiar alertness. The commander's eyes were moving systematically across the rows of seated guests, as if searching for someone specific. As the commander passed Robert's row, something made him pause. He stopped mid-stride and turned his head. His eyes locked onto Robert, and for a long moment the 2 men stared at each other. The commander's expression changed from professional focus to something Robert could not quite identify. Surprise, perhaps? Recognition, definitely. The younger man's eyes had dropped to Robert's arm, where his jacket sleeve had ridden up slightly, revealing more of his faded tattoo. Robert felt his mouth go dry. The tattoo was old. The ink faded to a blue-green that had long ago lost its original sharpness. It showed an eagle, globe, and anchor, but with specific modifications that marked it as something beyond a standard military tattoo. Beneath the eagle were numbers and symbols that most people would not recognize or understand. But this SEAL commander understood. Robert could see it in his eyes. The commander took 3 steps toward Robert's row. People shifted in their seats, confused by what was happening. The young mother next to Robert gathered her sleeping children closer, unsure of what was unfolding. The commander stopped directly in front of Robert and came to attention, his back straight, his eyes forward. Then, slowly and deliberately, the SEAL commander saluted. It was not a casual salute. It was the kind of salute that carried weight, that conveyed respect and recognition. The gymnasium fell completely silent. Even the graduates on stage had turned to watch. Robert sat frozen in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. Years of training and instinct took over. Despite his age, despite his stiff joints and tired body, Robert rose from his seat and returned the salute. His hand was steady as it came up to his forehead, holding the position with the same precision he had learned more than 50 years ago. The two men held their salutes for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 5 seconds. When they dropped their hands, the commander extended his right hand to Robert. They shook hands firmly, and Robert could feel the calluses on the younger man's palm, the grip of someone who still trained hard and stayed ready. The commander leaned in close and spoke quietly. His words meant only for Robert's ears. "I know what that tattoo means, sir. My grandfather had one similar. He served in the same unit." Robert's eyes widened slightly. He had not spoken about that unit in decades. Most people did not even know it had existed. The operations were still classified, buried under layers of government secrecy and time. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The commander continued, his voice still low. "He told me stories before he passed. Stories about men who did impossible things. Men who went places no one was supposed to go. I joined the SEALs because of those stories, sir. Because of men like you." Robert felt his eyes filling with tears again, but this time they were different tears. These were tears for brothers who never came home, for missions that could never be acknowledged, for sacrifices that went unrecorded in history books. The commander seemed to understand without Robert having to say anything. "Would you stand, sir? Please. I want everyone here to know what real service looks like." Robert wanted to refuse. He had spent so many years being invisible, being just another old man. He had never sought recognition or attention. That was not why he had served. But something in the commander's eyes told him this was important, that this moment meant something beyond his own comfort. The commander turned to address the gymnasium, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, graduates, faculty, and guests, I apologize for the interruption, but there is someone here today who deserves recognition." He gestured to Robert, who stood awkwardly beside his seat. Every face in the gymnasium turned toward the back. Robert could see Tommy standing up with his fellow graduates, craning his neck to see what was happening. Maria was somewhere in the crowd, probably confused and worried. "This man," the commander continued, "served our country in ways that most people cannot imagine and will never know about. The tattoo on his arm marks him as a member of one of the most elite and secretive units in military history. These men operated behind enemy lines in conditions that would break most people. They saved countless lives. They changed the course of battles. And they did it all without recognition, without medals, without anyone ever knowing their names." The gymnasium was absolutely silent. Robert could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He wanted to sit down, to disappear, but the commander's hand was now on his shoulder, keeping him standing. Many of his brothers never came home. Those who did were sworn to secrecy. They carried their burdens silently, never seeking glory or attention. They went back to ordinary lives, became ordinary citizens. But there is nothing ordinary about them. The commander's voice grew stronger. This man came here today simply to watch his grandson graduate. He drove 3 hours alone. He sat in the back, not wanting to draw attention to himself. But I happened to see his tattoo, and I cannot let this moment pass without acknowledging what he represents. Robert felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on him. He saw parents pointing him out to their children. He saw teachers whispering to each other. Most importantly, he saw Tommy, pushing through the rows of graduates trying to reach him. The commander turned back to Robert. "Sir, on behalf of every service member who knows what you and your unit accomplished, thank you. Your service mattered. Your sacrifices were not in vain, and the fact that you are here today, supporting the next generation, shows that the best of our country continues." The applause started slowly, then built like a wave. It grew louder and louder until the entire gymnasium was on its feet, clapping and cheering. Robert stood there overwhelmed as this unexpected recognition washed over him. The young mother next to him was crying. Her children, now awake, were clapping too, even though they did not understand why. Through the crowd, Robert finally saw Maria. She had her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Next to her, Tommy had broken free from the graduate section and was making his way toward his grandfather. The applause continued as Tommy finally reached his grandfather. The young man still wore his cap and gown, his diploma clutched in one hand. He wrapped his arms around Robert in a tight embrace, and Robert could feel his grandson shaking. Whether from excitement, pride, or emotion, he could not tell. Probably all three. "Grandpa," Tommy whispered into his ear. "I never knew. You never told me." Robert patted his grandson's back gently. "There was nothing to tell, boy. I was just doing my job. But even as he said it, Robert knew it was more than that. It had always been more than that. The memories he had locked away for so long were suddenly rushing back. Faces of men he had served with. The smell of jungle rain. The weight of equipment on his back as they moved silently through enemy territory. The fear that lived in his stomach during every mission. The relief when they made it back alive. And the grief when they did not. The SEAL commander gave them a moment, then gestured for his companions to come forward. They carried between them a folded flag and a small wooden box. Robert's eyes widened as he recognized what was happening. The commander was presenting him with honors that should have been given decades ago but never were, because of the classified nature of his service. "Sir," the commander said formally, "this flag has flown over our SEAL training facility. We want you to have it as a token of respect from the current generation of warriors to those who paved the way." He handed the folded flag to Robert with both hands, and Robert accepted it with trembling fingers. The weight of it felt significant, symbolic of everything it represented. One of the other SEALs opened the wooden box. Inside was a challenge coin, but not an ordinary one. This coin was larger, heavier, and bore the insignia of Naval Special Warfare. The commander lifted it out and pressed it into Robert's palm. "This coin represents brotherhood, sir. Any service member who sees this coin will know what it means. You are forever part of this family." Robert stared at the coin in his hand. In the Special Operations community, challenge coins were sacred. They represented bonds forged in the hardest circumstances, trust built on life and death situations. He had never expected to receive one, especially not after all these years. Maria had finally made her way through the crowd. She reached her father and hugged him tightly, not caring that they were the center of attention in a gymnasium full of strangers. "Dad," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you. I always knew you were special, but I never understood how much." Robert held his daughter with one arm, still clutching the flag and coin with the other. "I'm sorry I never told you everything, Mia. Some things, they make you sign papers. You promised not to talk about it." "I kept my promise." "I understand," Maria said, pulling back to look at his face. Her eyes were red from crying, but she was smiling. "But now everyone knows. Now Tommy knows what kind of man his grandfather really is." The principal approached them, looking somewhat overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. "Mr. Martinez, we would be honored if you would join us on stage. Perhaps you could say a few words to the graduates?" Robert's first instinct was to refuse. He was not a public speaker. He had spent his life in the shadows, not in spotlights. But then he looked at Tommy, who was nodding encouragingly, and at the commander, who gave him a slight nod of respect. Maybe, Robert thought, he did have something to say, not about his service specifically, but about what he had learned from it. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll try." The crowd parted as Robert made his way to the stage, flanked by the 3 SEALs. His leg was hurting more now from standing so long, and he limped noticeably as he walked, but he kept his back as straight as he could, his head up. The young graduates watched him with new eyes, seeing not just an old man, but someone who represented living history. Climbing the steps to the stage was harder than Robert expected. The commander offered his arm for support, and Robert accepted it gratefully. When they reached the microphone, Robert stood there for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces. He placed the flag and coin carefully on the podium in front of him. "I'm not good with speeches," he began, his voice rough from emotion and amplified by the microphone. "Never have been. I'm a simple man who lived a simple life. But since the commander here decided to make a big deal about an old tattoo, I suppose I should say something." Nervous laughter rippled through the audience. Robert relaxed slightly. They were just people, he reminded himself. Parents and grandparents like him, young people starting their lives. "Nothing to be afraid of. I came here today to watch my grandson graduate. Tommy over there, he's the real hero in this family. His mother raised him right, worked 2 jobs to give him opportunities. He studied hard, stayed out of trouble, made good choices. That takes a different kind of courage than what I did in my service days." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "When I was young, younger than you graduate sitting here today, I thought courage meant not being afraid. I thought it meant being tough and strong and never showing weakness. But I learned different over the years." Robert's eyes found Tommy in the crowd. "Real courage is getting up every day and doing what needs to be done even when it's hard. It's your mama working 2 jobs to keep a roof over your head. It's staying in school when dropping out seems easier. It's choosing the right path even when the wrong one looks more fun. The gymnasium was completely quiet now. Everyone was listening. Robert continued, his voice stronger. The tattoo on my arm, it marks a time in my life when I did things I can't talk about, in places I can't name, with men who were the finest I ever knew. Some of them never came home. They gave everything for their country, for people they would never meet, for a future they would never see. He paused again, emotion thick in his throat. But you know what? Every one of them would tell you the same thing I'm telling you now. The real victory isn't on some battlefield far away. The real victory is right here. It's in classrooms and homes. It's in young people who study and learn and become better than we were. It's in families staying together and supporting each other. That's what we fought for. That's what mattered. Robert looked around at all the faces. So when you walk out of here today with your diplomas, remember something. You don't need to join the military or do anything dramatic to serve your country. You serve it by being good people, by working hard, by treating others with respect, by raising your own children right someday. That's the mission that really matters. He picked up the flag and coin from the podium. This flag and this coin, they mean a lot to me, more than I can say. But you know what means more? Seeing my grandson in that cap and gown, seeing all of you about to start your lives. That's the real prize. That's what makes everything worthwhile. Robert stepped back from the microphone, unsure if he had said too much or too little. But the applause that erupted told him he had struck a chord. The graduates stood up, followed by their families. Even the teachers and staff were on their feet. The commander shook his hand firmly, his eyes showing approval. As Robert made his way off the stage, he felt lighter somehow. For so many years, he had carried the weight of his past silently, never talking about it, never sharing it. Now in this unexpected moment, some of that weight had lifted, not because of the recognition or the honors, but because he had finally connected his past to the present, shown his grandson and these young people that service and sacrifice were part of a continuum that included them. After the ceremony officially ended, Robert found himself surrounded by people. Parents wanted to shake his hand and thank him for his service. Teachers wanted to hear stories. Young children stared at him with wide eyes as if he were a character from a movie come to life. Robert tried to be gracious, but the attention was exhausting. He was not used to being the center of anything. The SEAL commander had stayed close, running interference when things got too overwhelming. He understood what Robert was feeling. There was a reason men like them preferred the shadows. The commander finally suggested they move outside where there was more space and fresh air. Robert agreed gratefully. Outside the gymnasium, in the parking lot, the spring air felt wonderful after the stuffiness inside. Robert leaned against his old pickup truck, feeling his age in every bone. Maria and Tommy joined him along with the 3 SEALs who seemed in no hurry to leave. "Commander," Robert said, "I appreciate what you did in there, but you didn't have to make such a fuss. I'm nobody special." The commander smiled. "With respect, sir, that's exactly wrong. You and the men you served with were very special. My grandfather spent his last years wishing people knew about what his unit accomplished. He died feeling like his service didn't matter because nobody could acknowledge it." Robert understood that feeling all too well. There had been many dark nights over the years when he wondered if any of it had mattered. When the nightmares came and he questioned whether the sacrifices had been worth it. Hearing this young commander validate those years meant more than any medal ever could. "What was your grandfather's name?" Robert asked. "James Patterson." He went by Pat. He served from 1963 to 1971. Robert's eyes widened. "Pat Patterson? Big guy, red hair, could run faster than anyone I ever saw?" Now it was the commander's turn to look surprised. "You knew him?" "Knew him? He saved my life. Twice." Robert felt his throat tighten with emotion. "We were in Cambodia, supposed to be a quick in and out. Things went sideways. Pat carried me 3 miles on his back after I took shrapnel in my leg. Never complained once, never slowed down. Then he went back for another wounded man." The commander's eyes glistened. "He never told me that story. He never told me any names. Just talked in general terms about the missions, the men he served with. Security oath," Robert explained. "We all took it seriously. Even after things got declassified in bits and pieces, the habit of silence was too strong. Plus, talking about it meant remembering things we tried hard to forget." One of the other SEALs spoke up. "Sir, if you're willing, we'd like to record your stories. Not for the public, but for the archives. There's so little documentation about what your unit did. First-hand accounts are precious." Robert considered this. He had never thought his memories would be valuable to anyone. They were just scenes that played in his head, especially at night, but maybe putting them into words, preserving them, would give them meaning beyond the nightmares. "I could do that," he said slowly. "Not today, but sometime. I'd need to think about what I can say and what needs to stay buried. That's all we ask, sir. We'll work around any restrictions." The SEAL handed Robert a business card. "My name is Lieutenant Jake Morrison. When you're ready, just call that number. We'll set everything up." Tommy had been quiet, taking everything in. Now he spoke up. "Grandpa, can I ask you something?" "Anything, boy. Were you scared when you did those missions?" Robert looked at his grandson and decided to give him the truth. "Terrified. Every single time. Anyone who says they weren't scared is either lying or crazy. Fear keeps you sharp, keeps you alert. The trick is not letting it control you." "How did you do that?" "Control the fear?" "By focusing on my brothers, the men next to me. I wasn't fighting for some abstract idea of freedom or democracy. I was fighting to keep them alive, and they were fighting to keep me alive. When you have that bond, that connection, the fear gets pushed to the side." Maria had been listening quietly. She put her hand on her father's arm. "I wish Mom was alive to see this, to know the truth about what you did." Robert's wife had passed away 5 years ago. Cancer had taken her slowly and painfully. She had known about his service, knew it was classified, but he had never shared details even with her. Now he wondered if he should have. Maybe it would have helped her understand why he sometimes woke up screaming, why certain sounds made him flinch, why he could never watch fireworks on the 4th of July. "Your mother understood the important things," Robert said to Maria. "She knew I loved her, and you kids. She knew I tried my best to be a good husband and father. The rest, the details of what happened overseas, she didn't need to know all that." The commander checked his watch. "Sir, we need to head back to base. But before we go, I want you to know something. Every SEAL who graduates training learns about the men who came before. The pioneers who developed the tactics and techniques we still use today. Your unit was part of that foundation. You helped build what we do today." Robert had never thought about it that way. He had always seen his service as isolated incidents, missions that happened and then were over. The idea that it had contributed to something larger, something ongoing, was new to him. "We honor our predecessors in everything we do," the commander continued. "Every time we plan a mission, every time we train, we're building on what you and your generation learned the hard way. That's your legacy, sir." The 3 SEALs came to attention and saluted in unison. Robert, still holding the folded flag, managed to return the salute despite his full hands. Then they shook hands all around and the SEALs walked to their vehicle. Before getting in, the commander turned back. "Mr. Martinez, attend any SEAL event or visit any SEAL base with that challenge coin, and you'll be treated as family. That's a promise." Robert watched them drive away, then looked down at the coin in his hand. It was heavy and solid, with intricate details in the metal. On one side was the SEAL trident. On the other were words, "The only easy day was yesterday." He knew that motto. He had lived that motto long before the SEALs ever adopted it. "Grandpa," Tommy said, breaking into his thoughts, "would you tell me more about your service?" "I want to know everything." Robert looked at his grandson's eager face. The boy was 18, the same age Robert had been when he joined up. But Tommy's life was so different. He had opportunities Robert never had. He was going to college in the fall, the first in their family to do so. Maria had made sure of that, saving every penny she could. "I'll tell you some things," Robert said carefully. "Not everything, because some things are still classified and some things are just too painful. But I'll share what I can. You deserve to know where you come from, what blood runs in your veins." Maria hugged them both. "How about we go get lunch, my treat? We should celebrate Tommy's graduation properly." Robert started to protest about the expense, but Maria cut him off. "Dad, you drove 3 hours to be here. The least I can do is buy you a meal. Besides, today is special. It's not every day your son graduates and you find out your father is a genuine war hero." "Not a hero," Robert said firmly. "Just a man who did his job." But as they walked toward Maria's car, Robert allowed himself to feel something he had not felt in a very long time. Pride. Not the quiet, private pride he felt watching his family grow and succeed, but pride in himself and what he had done in the years of service he had given. The commander had called it a legacy. Maybe it was. The restaurant Maria chose was a small diner not far from the school. It was the kind of place with vinyl booths and laminated menus, where the coffee was strong and the portions were generous. They slid into a corner booth, Tommy and Maria on one side, Robert on the other. He placed the folded flag carefully on the seat beside him, treating it with the reverence it deserved. Over burgers and fries, Tommy peppered his grandfather with questions. What did the tattoo mean? What countries had he been to? What was the scariest moment? Robert answered what he could, carefully editing out the violence and death, focusing instead on the brotherhood, the training, the sense of purpose. As they ate, Robert found himself sharing stories he had not told anyone in decades. He talked about the training that had pushed him beyond what he thought were his limits, how they taught them to survive in impossible conditions with minimal supplies, how they learned to move silently through the jungle, to read tracks and signs, to become invisible when they needed to be. Tommy listened with rapt attention, his food growing cold on his plate. What made you decide to join, Grandpa? You were so young. Robert took a sip of his coffee, thinking back to that 17-year-old boy he had been. Things were different then. The country was at war, and I felt like I needed to do my part. Plus, life at home was hard. My father drank too much, and there was never enough money. The military seemed like a way out, a way to make something of myself. Did you go straight into special operations? No, I started regular Navy just like everyone else. Did my basic training, served on a ship for a while, but I was restless. I wanted to do more, be more. When I heard about a special unit that was forming, one that would do unconventional warfare, I volunteered. Most of the guys who applied got turned down. The selection process was brutal. We started with about 200 men and only 30 made it through. Maria reached across the table and squeezed her father's hand. I'm trying to imagine you at 18 going through all that. It's hard. You were just a baby. I thought I was a man, Robert said with a slight smile. Looking back now, I see how young we all were. But war doesn't wait for you to grow up. It forces you to grow up fast. The waitress came to refill their coffee cups. She was an older woman, probably in her 60s, and she had been watching their table with interest. Excuse me, she said to Robert. I couldn't help but notice the flag you're carrying. Are you military? Robert nodded. Was, a long time ago. My husband served in Vietnam. He passed away 3 years ago. Thank you for your service. Her eyes were wet as she walked away. Robert felt the familiar weight of those words. People said thank you for your service all the time now, usually without really understanding what they were thanking him for. But that woman understood. She had lived with a veteran, had probably dealt with the nightmares and the silences and all the invisible wounds that soldiers brought home. Tommy brought him back to the present. Will you come visit me at college? I'm going to State University. It's only about 2 hours from your place. Of course I will. Proud as I am of you, boy. First Martinez to go to college. That's something special. I want to study engineering. Maybe work for NASA someday, help build spacecraft. Tommy's eyes lit up as he talked about his dreams. Robert felt his chest swell with pride. This was what it had all been for. So that boys like Tommy could dream about the stars instead of worrying about survival, so that they could plan futures instead of wondering if they would see tomorrow. Your grandmother would have loved to see this, Robert said quietly. She always knew you were special. Used to say you had a brain that needed feeding. Maria's eyes filled with tears again. Mom was so proud of both of you. Even when she was sick at the end, she would talk about Tommy's grades and your service. She kept newspaper clippings about military history, even though you never told her details. I think she was trying to understand what you went through. Robert had not known that. His wife had never mentioned it. She had always been so strong, so supportive, never pushing him to talk about things he could not or would not discuss. Now he realized she had been doing her own research, trying to bridge the gap between what she knew and what she could not be told. I should have talked to her more, Robert said, his voice rough with regret. Should have explained things better. Dad, she understood. She loved you. That was enough. They finished their meal in comfortable silence. Robert insisted on leaving the tip, pulling out a few bills from his worn wallet. It was not much, but it was what he could afford. As they stood to leave, several other diners approached him. Word had apparently spread about what happened at the graduation. People wanted to shake his hand, thank him, tell him their own military stories. Robert was gracious but relieved when they finally made it outside. The sun was high overhead now and the day was warm. He had the long drive home ahead of him and he was feeling tired. but it was a good tired, the kind that comes from a day well spent. Dad, are you sure you don't want to stay at my place tonight? That's a long drive and you must be exhausted. Robert considered it. Maria's apartment was small, just 2 bedrooms. He would be putting her out, probably sleeping on the couch, plus his own bed was calling to him. His own space where he could process everything that had happened today. No, mija. I'll be fine. I like driving at night anyway. Less traffic. Promise me you'll call when you get home so I know you made it safely. I promise. Tommy gave his grandfather another long hug. Thank you for coming, Grandpa. This was the best graduation gift ever having you here. Wouldn't have missed it for the world, boy. You study hard at that college, you hear? Make us all proud, I will. And Grandpa? I'm proud of you too. What the commander said about you being a hero, I always knew it. I just didn't know the details. Robert climbed into his pickup truck, placing the flag carefully on the passenger seat. As he started the engine, Maria knocked on his window. He rolled it down. Dad, I love you. And I'm sorry if I ever made you feel like you had to hide your past from us. You did what you had to do, and I'm grateful for the man you are. I love you too, mija. You raised a good boy there, better than I could have done. You taught me how, by being the father you were, by showing up even when things were hard, by putting family first. That's the legacy that really matters. Robert drove away from the school, watching in his rearview mirror as Maria and Tommy stood together, waving. He thought about the commander's words about legacy. He thought about Pat Patterson and the other men he had served with. He thought about the missions and the fear and the brotherhood that had sustained him through it all. But mostly he thought about the future. About Tommy going to college and reaching for the stars. About Maria, who had overcome so much to give her son a better life. About great-grandchildren he might someday have. Growing up in a world that, despite its problems, offered opportunities his generation could only dream about. The drive home was long, but Robert did not mind. He had plenty to think about. The challenge coin was in his pocket, heavy against his chest. The flag sat beside him like a silent companion. And in his heart, for the first time in many years, he felt a sense of peace. As the miles rolled by, Robert allowed himself to remember more of his service. Not the violent parts, not the missions that still cause nightmares, but the good parts. The camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the knowledge that what they were doing mattered, even if the world would never know about it. He remembered Pat Patterson more clearly now. The man had been larger than life, always joking even in the worst situations. Pat had a wife and 2 kids waiting for him at home, and he talked about them constantly. Showed everyone pictures until they were sick of seeing them, but they all understood. Those pictures were what kept Pat going, what made him fight to survive and come home. Robert wondered if Pat's grandson, the commander, had those same pictures. If Pat's stories had inspired another generation to serve. The circle of it all, the way service and sacrifice passed down through families, seemed profound in a way Robert had never considered before. The sun was setting by the time Robert reached the highway that would take him home. The sky was painted in oranges and purples, beautiful in the way that only spring sunsets could be. Robert cracked his window to let in the fresh air, and for the first time in a long time he felt young again. Robert reached his small apartment just as the last light was fading from the sky. The building was nothing special, just a plain 2-story complex on the edge of town where rent was cheap and neighbors kept to themselves. He had moved here after his wife died, unable to stay in the house where they had raised their children. Too many memories in those empty rooms. He carried the folded flag inside carefully, treating it like the precious thing it was. His apartment was small but neat. 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a living room with an old television and a worn recliner. The walls were mostly bare except for a few family photos, Maria as a little girl, his wedding picture, Tommy at various ages growing from a baby into the young man he was now. Robert set the flag on the coffee table and sank into his recliner with a groan. His leg was throbbing from all the standing and walking. He should take his medicine, but he was too tired to get up. Instead, he pulled out the challenge coin and studied it in the lamplight. The weight of it felt significant, like it contained all the years and all the memories compressed into metal. The phone rang, startling him. It was the old landline he insisted on keeping, despite Maria's attempts to convince him that a cell phone was enough. He pushed himself up and answered it on the 4th ring. "Dad, you made it home okay?" Maria's worried voice came through. "Yes, mija. Just walked in the door. I was going to call you in a minute. Liar. You were going to fall asleep in that chair and forget all about it. Robert smiled. His daughter knew him too well. Maybe so. It's been a long day. The best day, Maria said. Dad, people are still talking about what happened. Tommy's been getting messages all evening from his classmates. Everyone wants to know more about his war hero grandfather. I'm not a hero, Maria. How many times do I have to say it? You are to us. You've always been my hero, Dad. Even before today, just for different reasons. They talked for a few more minutes, then Maria made him promise again to rest and take care of himself. After hanging up, Robert did take his medicine and made himself a simple dinner of soup and bread. He ate slowly, thinking about the day's events, still trying to process everything that had happened. That night, Robert slept better than he had in months. Usually, the nightmares came whenever something triggered memories of his service. But tonight, there were no nightmares. Just dreams of Tommy graduating, of the pride on Maria's face, of the commander's salute. Good dreams for a change. The next few days passed quietly. Robert fell back into his routine. Grocery shopping on Tuesday. Coffee at the diner on Wednesday morning where he met with other veterans. Watching game shows in the evening. But something had changed. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter. On Thursday morning, there was a knock at his door. Robert was not expecting anyone, and he approached cautiously. Years of training made him careful even in his own home. He looked through the peephole and saw a young man in a delivery uniform holding a large package. Mr. Martinez, I have a delivery for you. Needs a signature. Robert opened the door and signed for the package. It was heavy and marked as fragile. After the delivery man left, Robert carried it to his kitchen table and carefully opened it. Inside, wrapped in protective padding, was a framed photograph. But it was not just any photograph. The image showed a group of men in jungle fatigues, young and lean and hard-looking. They stood in formation, faces serious, weapons at their sides. Robert's breath caught in his throat. This was his unit. This was the photograph that had been taken just before their last mission together. The mission where 3 of these men never came back. There was a note attached, handwritten on official military stationery. Robert recognized the handwriting from the business card. Lieutenant Morrison had sent this. Mr. Martinez, we found this photograph in the declassified archives. We thought you should have a copy. Also, the commander wanted you to know that he spoke with his grandmother, Pat Patterson's widow. She would like to meet you if you're willing. Her number is below. With respect, Lieutenant Morrison. Robert stared at the photograph for a long time. He could name every man in it, could remember their voices, their jokes, their fears. Some had survived the war and gone home to build lives. Others had not been so lucky. And all of them, the living and the dead, had been forgotten by history because their service could not be acknowledged. He traced his finger over the faces. There was Pat Patterson in the back row, taller than everyone else, that cocky grin on his face. Next to him was Jimmy Chen, who could speak 6 languages and had saved them all more times than Robert could count. In the front was their commanding officer, Lieutenant Hayes, the only officer most of them would have followed into hell itself. Robert had not seen this photograph in over 50 years. He had not even known copies existed. The military usually destroyed such evidence of units that officially never existed. But someone had saved this one, preserved it, and now it had found its way back to him. He spent the rest of that day calling the numbers listed on old papers he had kept in a box under his bed. Papers he had not looked at in years. Phone numbers of men from his unit. Addresses that were probably decades out of date. Most of the numbers did not work anymore, but 3 did. The first was Charlie Morrison, no relation to the lieutenant. Charlie had been their demolitions expert. A quiet man who could blow up anything or build anything depending on what was needed. He was living in Florida now, retired from a career as a construction supervisor. Robert Martinez. Charlie's voice was older, but still recognizable. I'll be damned. How long has it been? Too long, Charlie. Too long. They talked for an hour, remembering the good times and carefully avoiding the bad. Charlie told him about his 4 kids, 8 grandchildren, about his wife of 45 years who still did not know exactly what he had done in the service, about the nightmares that still came sometimes but not as often as they used to. The second call reached David Kim, who had been their medic. David was now a doctor, had put himself through medical school on the GI Bill after the war. He lived in California, still practiced part-time at a clinic that served veterans. Martinez, I heard something interesting happened at a high school graduation recently. Was that you? Word traveled fast in the veteran community, apparently. Robert told him about Tommy's graduation, about the SEAL commander recognizing his tattoo. David laughed, a sound Robert had not heard in decades. It's about time someone acknowledged what we did. I've been fighting for years to get our unit's records declassified. Finally got somewhere last year. That's probably why they found that photograph. They talked about the others from their unit who was still alive, who had passed away. The list of the dead was longer than Robert wanted to think about. Old age and illness had taken more of his brothers than the war ever had. The third number connected him to Sandra Hayes, the widow of their commanding officer. Lieutenant Hayes had died in 1995, but Sandra remembered Robert immediately. "Robert, it's so good to hear your voice. John talked about you boys until the day he died. He was so proud of the unit, even though he could never tell anyone what you accomplished." They talked about Lieutenant Hayes, about the kind of leader he had been. Sandra told Robert something he had never known. Her husband had carried guilt for the rest of his life about the men who did not come home. He blamed himself, even though everyone knew he had made the best decisions possible under impossible circumstances. "I wish he could have lived to see the unit getting recognition," Sandra said. "It would have meant so much to him." After those calls, Robert felt both better and worse. Better because he had reconnected with pieces of his past, with people who understood what he had been through. Worse because it brought back so many memories, so much loss. That evening, he called the number for Pat Patterson's widow, Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered. Her voice was elderly but strong. "Mrs. Patterson, my name is Robert Martinez. Your grandson, the commander, suggested I call." There was a sharp intake of breath. "Robert Martinez. Pat talked about you. He said you were one of the best soldiers he ever served with. Your husband saved my life, ma'am. More than once. I owed him everything." They talked for over an hour. Eleanor told Robert about Pat's life after the war, how he had struggled with what he had seen and done, how he had worked as a police officer, still trying to serve and protect, how he had been a wonderful father and grandfather, passing on his values to the next generation. "He never told me details," Eleanor said, "but I knew. I saw it in his eyes sometimes, the memories. I saw how he would wake up at night, reaching for weapons that weren't there. But he was a good man, Robert. The best man I ever knew, he was. One of the finest. Would you come visit me? I live in Virginia, just outside of Washington. I have things of Pat's I think you should see. Letters he wrote but never sent. Journal entries. He documented everything, even though he couldn't share it." Robert agreed. He would make the drive next week. It would be good to meet Eleanor in person, to share memories of Pat with someone who loved him, and maybe, just maybe, it would help both of them find some peace. 3 weeks after Tommy's graduation, Robert found himself standing in front of a neat brick house in a quiet Virginia suburb. The drive from his place had taken 8 hours, but he had made it without trouble. His old pickup truck had handled the highway miles better than he expected. Eleanor Patterson was waiting on the porch as he pulled up, a small woman in her late 70s with white hair and kind eyes. "Robert," she said, coming down the steps to greet him. "I feel like I already know you from all of Pat's stories." They shook hands, then Eleanor surprised him by pulling him into a hug. Robert stiffened for a moment, then relaxed. This woman had been married to one of his brothers. That made her family in a way that went deeper than blood. Inside, the house was warm and filled with photographs. Pat Patterson smiled down from frames on every wall. In his uniform and civilian clothes, at his children's weddings, holding his grandchildren. Robert recognized the man in the photos, but the last time he had seen Pat was in 1968. Both of them covered in mud and exhaustion after a mission that had gone wrong and then somehow gone right. "Sit down, please." Eleanor gestured to a comfortable sofa. "Can I get you something to drink? Coffee, tea, water?" "Coffee would be good, ma'am. Black, no sugar." While Eleanor was in the kitchen, Robert studied the photographs more carefully. There was the commander, Pat's grandson, at various ages. Other grandchildren, too. Pat had built a good life after the war. That was important. Too many of their brothers had not managed it. Eleanor returned with 2 cups of coffee and a large box. She set the box on the coffee table between them. Pat kept everything in here. He couldn't talk about his service, but he wrote about it. Journals, letters to men from the unit that he never mailed, I found all of this after he passed away. Our son, the commander's father, wanted to throw it out, but something told me to keep it. Robert opened the box carefully. Inside were several leather-bound journals, stacks of letters, photographs he had never seen, and military documents that probably should have been destroyed decades ago. He picked up one of the journals and opened it to a random page. The entry was dated August 1967. Pat's handwriting was neat and precise, the words of a man trying to make sense of things that made no sense. He wrote about a mission, about the fear they had all felt, about how Robert had kept his head when everyone else wanted to panic. Robert did not remember being particularly calm. He remembered being terrified, but maybe that was how it had looked from the outside. He wrote about you a lot, Eleanor said softly, about how young you were but how you never complained, about the time you carried another soldier for hours after he was wounded, about how you always volunteered for the most dangerous assignments. Robert shook his head. I wasn't brave, ma'am. I was just trying to survive. We all were. That's what Pat said too. But I think you're both wrong. Courage isn't not being afraid. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear. That's what you boys did. They spent the afternoon going through the box together. Eleanor shared stories about Pat's life after the war, how he struggled at first but found his way, how he became a police officer because he still needed to serve, still needed to protect people, how he had been a loving father, though sometimes distant as if part of him was still back in those jungles. Did he have nightmares? Robert asked, all the time, especially in the early years. He would wake up screaming, talking about people I didn't know, places he couldn't name. I learned to just hold him until he calmed down. Sometimes that helped. Sometimes nothing helped. Robert nodded. He understood that all too well. His own wife had done the same thing for him, though they never talked about it. Just her presence in the bed beside him had been enough to bring him back from whatever dark place the nightmares took him. One of the letters in the box was addressed to Robert, written, but never sent. Pat had written it in 1985, more than a decade after the war ended. Robert read it with trembling hands. Robert, I wonder where you are, what you're doing. I tried to find you over the years, but never could. Maybe you changed your name, went off the grid like some of the others did. I don't blame you. Sometimes I wish I had done the same. But I wanted you to know that I think about you and the others all the time, about what we did, what we saw, about the men we lost. I hope you found peace, brother. I'm still looking for mine. Your friend always, Pat. Robert had to set the letter down because his hands were shaking too hard to hold it. Tears ran down his face and he did not bother to wipe them away. Eleanor handed him a tissue and waited quietly while he composed himself. I'm sorry, Robert said finally. I thought I was past crying about this stuff. You never get past it. You just learn to live with it. Pat cried too, even years later. There's no shame in it. They talked until the sun started setting. Eleanor insisted Robert stay for dinner and offered him the guest room for the night. The next day she wanted to take him to Arlington National Cemetery. Pat was buried there, along with so many others who had served. Over dinner, they were joined by Pat's son Michael, the commander's father. Michael was in his 50s, a businessman who had never served in the military. He shook Robert's hand warmly. My son told me about meeting you at that graduation. He was really moved by it. Dad would have been too. They talked about the commander, about how Pat's legacy had inspired another generation to serve. Michael admitted he had never fully understood his father's service, had been frustrated by his silence about it. Only now, seeing these journals and letters, was he beginning to comprehend what Pat had been through. I wish I had been more patient with him, Michael said. More understanding. I thought he was just being difficult when he wouldn't talk about the war. I didn't realize he literally couldn't, that he had taken oaths that prevented him from sharing. It wasn't just the oaths, Robert said gently. Sometimes the memories were too painful to put into words. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it was like? How do you make them understand without giving them nightmares too? That night, Robert slept in Pat Patterson's guest room, surrounded by the life his old friend had built. The room was comfortable and quiet, but Robert still woke several times, old habits making him alert to every sound. Each time he remembered where he was and who he was honoring by being there. The next morning, Eleanor drove them to Arlington. They stood in front of Pat's grave, a simple white headstone among thousands of others. Robert placed his hand on the stone, feeling the warmth from the sun that had been heating it all morning. I'm sorry I never came before, Robert said quietly. I should have been here years ago. Should have said goodbye properly. You're here now, Eleanor said. That's what matters. Pat would understand. Robert pulled out the challenge coin the commander had given him and held it up so the morning light caught the metal. Your grandson did you proud, Pat. He's carrying on what you started, making sure the next generation knows how to serve with honor. They stood there for a long time, 3 people connected by one man's service and sacrifice. Michael took photos saying he wanted the commander to see his grandfather's grave, with Robert standing there. It would mean a lot to him. Before leaving Virginia, Robert visited the Pentagon at Eleanor's suggestion. Lieutenant Morrison had arranged for a tour of the Naval Special Warfare Section. There, on a wall of honor, Robert saw names he recognized, brothers who had fallen in combat, their service finally being acknowledged decades later. Morrison showed him the memorial they were building, dedicated to all Special Operations Forces who had served in classified missions. Robert's unit would be included, their service finally recorded for history. It would not be public knowledge, but it would be preserved for those who needed to know. When will it be finished? Robert asked. Next year, sir. We'd like you to be here for the dedication. You and any other members of your unit who can make it. It's time your service was properly honored. Robert thought about Charlie in Florida, David in California, all the others scattered across the country. I'll talk to them. See who can come. A lot of us are getting old. Some won't be able to travel. We'll help with that, sir. Transportation, accommodations, whatever is needed. This is important. On the drive home, Robert thought about everything that had happened since Tommy's graduation. How one moment of recognition had opened up the past in ways he never expected. How connecting with Eleanor and seeing Pat's grave had brought a sense of closure he did not know he needed. His phone rang as he crossed the state line back into his home state. It was Tommy calling from college. Grandpa, how was your trip? Robert told him about meeting Eleanor, about seeing Pat's grave, about the memorial being built. Tommy listened eagerly, asking questions, wanting to understand this part of his grandfather's history. When you come visit me at college, Tommy said, will you bring some of those stories? My roommate is studying history. He'd love to hear about this stuff. I'll think about it, Robert said. Some stories are easier to tell than others. I understand. But Grandpa, I'm really proud of you. Not just for what you did in the war, but for who you are now. For driving all over the country to connect with people. For being Willer's story even when it's after hanging up. Robert drove the rest of the way home with a smile on his face. Tommy was right. It did take courage, open.